Okay, welcome back to Bitcoin Hard Talk, episode 82. We just completed This Week in Bitcoin, where we shared everything that's happening with Bitcoin and stables and the administration and where things are going next. Now we're going to be going through the macro section, and we're going to be honing in on the big, beautiful bill that the Trump administration has put forward, what it means in the macro environment, and why it was released, when it was released, and what the reaction was this week to the macro events, particularly the Japan Ponzi scheme, debt-based Ponzi scheme, and the US debt-based Ponzi scheme, and the reaction throughout all of the markets. We're going to be breaking it down. And in part 3, This Week in Geopolitics, I'm going to be going through the South Africa humiliation ritual at the White House and the latest around, what's happening, why we're moving to an environment of manufactured civil unrest. And when I follow the money, how I can see these things, and you can ignore the narratives, because it is more important than ever to remain psychologically strong. There is a very large psychological operation to mentally weaken people through all of the gaslighting that's happening. And I want to make sure that you are prepared for this transition to Bitcoin, AI, and central bank digital currencies, get you economically strong, but also most importantly, spiritually and mentally strong, because there is a very deliberate campaign with all of this social media and news and different events that are happening. We'll go through all of that in part 3. So let's get right into it. This week in macro, Bitcoin Hard Talk, episode 82, part 2. Right. So we started this week with the 3 main credit rating agencies. You have S&P, Standard & Poor's, you have Fitch, and you have Moody's. Now, S&P and Fitch have already downgraded the US credit rating in previous crises, saying you need to get your debt under control. The third one, which we all know, if anyone watched the financial crisis, you'll know that BlackRock was giving Aladdin AI technology to the Federal Reserve. The Fed was picking which companies to go bust, which ones to save, which one to take out, which one to cover up, like Jeffrey Epstein's banker, JP Morgan. And they were acquiring. And then what did they were able to do? They acquired iShares, which gave them the best assets from the European banks like Barclays in the UK. That meant they could build the ETF business. And they were able to acquire that. And they were able to get the government to lend them the money in pure crony capitalism. And they're able to use the credit rating agencies to take their products like mortgage-backed securities and credit default swaps and collateralized debt obligations, so that they can pass on those assets and they can slap a AAA rating on those Ponzi schemes, so that pensioners can buy them, so that they can buy them in your pension product, and you can end up holding the bag, and then they can have too big to fail institutions, and they call it a global financial crisis, and then essentially you pay the bill. They swipe out as much value, you socialize the losses, you privatize the gains, and then you end up in the environment that we've had since 2008. You kick the can down the road, wait for the next crisis, wait for the next debt-based Ponzi scheme to implode, and then you can use the credit rating agencies in order to put good ratings when you want them to be good, or lower ratings when you need to have some kind of change. And this all, rolls into my long-term thesis that BlackRock has partnered with BRICS and the GCC, the Gulf countries, and BRICS, the global south, headed by China, in order to usher in a multipolar world order and turn America into a technocratic artificial intelligence, state that can host all of the financialization of all of the key assets, and then that money can be transferred and redistributed into different halo or different parts. And I think it's BlackRock that is ushering in that and negotiating with the sovereign countries, as it has the competing powers that have remained sovereign, like Saudi Arabia, like China, and various other things. And so I've covered that in previous episodes. Feel free to binge and go back to previous episodes where I covered the multipolar world order, and I covered things like it's not China versus US, it's BlackRock versus the world, and various other predictions on the war that I've been doing. And I went through how US is being asset stripped last week. If you want to binge in those, Download it and you can catch up. Feel free to do that. But Moody started this week by downgrading the US credit rating from AA1. It was the credit rating has gone to AA1 from AAA. So you can see how they use these capitals and lowercase and ones in order to confuse people, in order to say, we know this is a debt-based Ponzi scheme, but now we need to take you from uppercase A, lowercase AA to uppercase A, lowercase A1. And so now all three credit rating agencies have downgraded the US debt. And at the same time, you see other nodes in the proof of weapons network come out to strategically weaken the dollar so they can manage these capital outflows into this multipolar world order that I believe is being engineered right in front of us as well. And so they cited concern of rising debt. No shit, Sherlock. We could have said that a long time ago. In fact, in my first published book, it was written in Mandarin and English as well. Bank to the Future. You can get a digital copy. There we go. In the Bitcoin Hard Talk free membership portal, if you don't want to buy it on Amazon. Anyway, covered this as well, that the end would be when the world goes virtual offices, you would have movements towards monetary reform, and then you have credit rating downgrades when the debt can no longer be purchased, and then we transition into a monetary reform environment. That was written 14 years ago and is playing out exactly as said as well. I also said you protect yourself by engaging in building social capital, as it were, and also having Bitcoin as well. Anyway, the IMF, another node on the proof of weapons network, came out and called the US in order to reduce the budget deficit and deal with the ever increasing debt burden. Now, we know, what does reducing the deficit mean? If you've been watching my macro previous ones, you'll know about the Triffin's dilemma. The Triffin's dilemma means if you have the world reserve currency, your job is to export dollars globally through the debt-based Ponzi scheme, through IMF predatory loans, and you take the world into war in order to get those large loans, and then you can control and force people onto the dollar standard. It was the Bretton Woods system. And then in 1971, they defaulted on it when they wouldn't exchange those dollars for gold. And we ended up in the ZIRP, zero interest rate environment that we went into. And then they would bail out the system at every crisis, whether it's the pump and dump, the dot-com boom and bust that wiped out my father's pension and got me into this subject in the first place, or whether it be long-term capital management, the smartest people in the room that created a hedge fund when no one knew what was in the black box, or whether it be the global financial crisis when Larry Fink created mortgage-backed securities and Blythe Masters created credit default swaps, and various other of these Wall Street veterans, or whether it be an operation like COVID, which is a redistribution of wealth to the technocracy, or whether it be the Silicon Valley Bank, where inflation is transitory, and then you wipe out the crypto-friendly banks and hand the industry over to BlackRock so they can launch their ETFs and get the banks in, like we've been reporting, or whether it be tariffs in order to reset the world to a multipolar world order, shrink the America into a regional power, send the small companies bust, consolidate them into the large corporations, get all of the large export-driven countries rolled up into BlackRock assets, financialize, securitize them, rage wars when you need to get more vassalized state, issue more loans, get them to buy more weapons for the military-industrial complex, or you drive all those partners over to China, and you have negotiations with the Middle East so that you can utilize their energy, and then you can make a load of money out of European wars. You get the picture? I'll go through it as a reminder, but I've been covering it throughout these different episodes as well. And you can control that through the flow of capital in these different power structures in the power dynamics. Anyway, This week, the US held a $16 billion auction of 20-year Treasury bonds. Now, what that means is that they are saying, who wants to lend us money? The US government is saying, who wants to lend us money for the next 20 years? And they set a rate at which they're willing to pay. And, the more distress or the less likely people are to lend, the higher the rates go, the higher the interest rate that needs to be paid. Now that impacts the previous treasuries in the debt-based Ponzi scheme. And so the market in these longer term bonds, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, they adjust where the market says, if they're paying this amount here in this auction, then it may crash the price of previous bonds, which pushes up the yield on the secondary market for these bonds. So if you remember, I released a video. You can go to simondixon.com and look at the blog post where I talked about the key indicators investors need to look at during these tariff trades. And I created a little short video where I talked about the different indicators. One of those is the 10-year yield on bonds in the bond market, and the 30-year, and they just tried to do an auction to test whether they could sell these 20-year bonds this week. Now, normally this is a trivial event. They just all get purchased. You have discount brokers if the Federal Reserve is issuing them, and you sell it out through the Goldman Sachs network, Cantor Fitzgerald network with the discount brokers, or you do an auction like this. And normally there's minimal disruption and everything goes. But this time was different this week. The investor demand in order to lend to the US government for 20 years, it came in weaker than it was actually expected. Now, it wasn't disastrous. It wasn't apocalyptic, like some would say, but it sent a signal out to the market that the demand isn't there. At the same time, this was a $16 billion issue. They've got to refinance this year $10 trillion. Why do you think they're desperate? If you didn't watch the This Week in Bitcoin, why do you think they're getting those stablecoin bills out right now? And why do you think Trump wants to be a stablecoin issuer and those connected so they can back it, profit from it, as covered in This Week in Bitcoin? But anyway, what this signaled to the market is a reduced appetite to lend money to the US government long term. People are willing to lend it short term, but 20 years, they don't know what the future looks like in 20 years. And so the bonds had to be sold at a discount. And that affects the price in the market. And that pushed up and drove up the price of the yields to over 5%. So on the yield essentially had to sell to 5.04%, which was above what they expected it to be, which is 5.035%. Now, these tiny little things, they sound like small numbers, but they are very meaningful in the compound debt-based Ponzi scheme, and it is a signal to the market as well. And so that was one of the key indicators that I said you should be looking for as well. So immediately, the reaction in the market was that the 30-year yield, so these are 30-year loans to the US government, it basically reached 5.02% in the market, which is the highest it has ever been since November 2023, which is when we had the distress in the Silicon Valley, bank run market. So it's moving towards those types of distress levels. It's not disaster yet, but these are bad signals as well. The 10-year, so if you want to lend to the US government for 10 year, it went above to 4.6%. It's corrected a little bit since then, but it had a big reaction in Japan. Now, Japan is significant because the Bank of Japan is essentially installed by the Federal Reserve and the Proof of Weapons Network. Those that at the end of World War II, they became vassal states for the debt-based Ponzi scheme in the Bretton Woods system by IMF. I don't want to go through that too deeply now. But anyway, Japan was one of those nodes in the Proof of Weapons Network, the Bank of Japan. And they created a ginormous pump and dump cycle that the stock market, after 35 years, has only just recovered. This was in the 1980s through to the 1990s. They had that lost decade that they talk about, where they had basically a zero interest rate policy where people could borrow from the Bank of Japan for free, then use that in order to speculate, and hedge funds would use that, hedge out the risk, and you have this thing called the Japan carry trade. Well, Japan decided the immediate reaction to this event was that the 30-year loans to the Japanese government, the bond yield started to surge significantly. In fact, it went up to its highest level in history, and this is 3.15%. And so for decades, Japan has been basically known for its low long-term interest rates. Now, we don't know what's behind that black box. We don't know what hedge funds have exposure to that, whether that needed to lead to liquidations, whether they've already hedged against that, what impact that has in the shadow banking, the derivatives market. We won't know because this is all hidden in the shadows. The name shadow banking is quite frankly right. But there is not, these are the types of signals that we need to be very, very aware with. This is a change in policy. And why is that change in policy happening at the same time as Japan and America and Trump going into a tariff war? Because BlackRock is the engineer of the tariff war. And the US government is simply a vassal state for these much higher power, stateless organizations that essentially control much of the corporate power. And then you control lobby and control government. And so you have this, this facade of democracy left and right. And Trump just puts narratives on top of BlackRock's policy. And you have power struggles in that network, in the proof of weapons network that I've covered. But if you're trying to reset the world order and you're trying to push previous bad relationships to good relationships, this is the perfect mechanism for doing it. Reverse the policy at the same time as tariffs. So now they are essentially dealing with, within Japan, high inflation, and they're shifting their policy and their outlook at the same time away from that lost decade zero interest environment. They have, during this shift, a national debt, a debt to GDP, the highest essentially of most of the most significant nations that we need to look at in analyzing these systemic risk events. They've got a debt to GDP of 260% as their ratio. Now, America is in 125% debt to GDP. So 260% sounds awful. But remember, America has the world reserve currency, and its number one export is the debt-based Ponzi scheme in order to push dollars, which is why it has a trade deficit and a fiscal deficit. If you're reversing that, then that can only lead to economic disaster or an environment where you roll over the debt-based Ponzi scheme. So we will see whether the Fed goes into a new QE program or they go for austerity and the Fed decides that the BlackRock strategy is to weaken US because we need more pain within US so that our large corporations can acquire more and more assets. And so they are maximizing the algorithm at the BlackRock level, Aladdin AI, in order to maximize the profits for their share price. And that has nothing to do with Make America Great Again. This is essentially the opposite of that. Now, what is the difference with Japan? Now, Japan weakens its currency because it has a manufacturing base. It exports lots of goods. And then it allows those debt to GDP to run because it has a trade surplus, which means that they have vast reserves that rather than paying down the debt or buying their own currency, they don't want to buy their currency because they want it to be cheaper when they export goods. And so instead, they buy dollars, they lend it to the US government, And so this is why Japan, with the exception of Cayman Islands, which is essentially code word for BlackRock and all these different pension schemes and various other things that's set up there, but the largest lender and purchaser of these treasuries is Japan. So Japan owns $1.1 trillion worth of US debt, making it essentially the largest foreign holder of US debt. And so Trump, through tariff policies, US, a proxy of BlackRock and its portfolio companies, is able to reset the world order in this mechanism. And after Liberation Day on April the 2nd, it was able to use this reversal of policy. Japan would dump its treasuries and then purchase and strengthen the currency. And this is how you can use these currency wars in order to exert the policy that BlackRock wants in order to optimize the value for its portfolio of companies and use these vassal states as mechanisms for implementing the policy as well. So what happened? Well, normally you'd get a bunch of manufacturing narrative to make it look like everything's good. But what did the Japan prime minister come out and say? Well, firstly, he said during the tariff war, we're no longer friends. We're holding strong. We're not going to concede. We're not going to enter into a deal. We'll stay here with these tariffs. But US, we are no longer, we're definitely not going to concede. And there was lots and lots of that narrative. We also had the Japan prime minister called the situation in Japan worse than Greece. What does that mean? The Greece debt crisis was a 2013 operation which led to the bail-ins and the confiscation of wealth from Russian oligarchs that held their wealth in Cypriot banks. And you use the debt crisis in order to get significant IMF leverage over many of the European countries, kick the can down the road a little bit further, and vassalize more and more states like Europe, which led to the operation where you strategically weaken Europe and many of the things that followed there through NATO policies that we saw. But anyway, Japan has two choices, and the ones that control the assets in Japan, i.e. BlackRock portfolio, can utilize Aladdin technology in order to control and optimize these algorithms to execute whatever, however they want to use Japan next, whether they want to, it doesn't have any care about humans. It doesn't care whether you're broke. It doesn't care whether there's inflation. It is just optimizing these algorithms for its own profits and share price. So it can sell assets if it wants to do that. It can sell them, strengthen the currency, buy back the currency. It can it can send America into higher and higher rates. That can be backed by stable coins. The stablecoin issuers then can purchase more Bitcoin, and you can optimize the algorithm, especially now BlackRock has got these Bitcoin ETFs. And it's got all the banks and financial institutions into it. So you can see how these mechanisms can be used in order to fire financial weapons of mass destruction whenever you choose. That's why I always get and talk about Bitcoin being held in self-custody and the resistance against it. Protect yourself from the Fed with Bitcoin and protect yourself from BlackRock with self-custody as well. And then you can observe and watch as it's done. And I just hope that you'll share this and more people get protected from this as well. Or essentially it can go pivot back to the same policy and it can become a bank for hedge funds. And what does BlackRock and its portfolio company hedge funds do? Like Blackstone that we covered, they're able to short these trades even if their influence over politicians and countries doesn't go so well. So if they launch a covert operation through the military industrial complex and that doesn't go the way it was planned, they can borrow from the Bank of Japan, they can short stocks through their hedge fund portfolio companies, and this mechanism can be used in order to redistribute power at the proof of weapons network as well through its host country, America. And then it can have low rates, whatever it wants to do. And so we'll keep covering it every single week as well. But the net reaction of America having to pay those higher rates to borrow, the net reaction of Japan having those rates go to all-time highs, is that it also had a net reaction to other governments as well. And so the cost to borrow, you can use these bond vigilantes, they call them, in the BlackRock proof of weapons network, in order to play the games, play the shenanigans that are needed to engineer the game for the optimum portfolio value. And that's why I'm trying to warn people that our governments no longer work for us. They never did, but they never do, they don't right now. And so this is the important message. So all our governments do is maximize the strategy for military, big pharma, the banking lobby, and this is how it's all exerted. And so once you understand that, you don't need to listen to the media or listen to the politicians or you can do the opposite of what they say when they pretend they're doing things like make America great again, and various other things. This system's too big for any one politician to come up against. So what else did we get? Right after these different actions, we got the redistribution of wealth to the BlackRock portfolio companies via its vassal state US, via its vassal politician, Trump, and the Trump administration. And so after the tour that we covered last week, where I said about all the deals to sell certain assets to the Middle East, the various other redistribution and push towards a multipolar world order, the different deals that were being done under the table, the different people that were at those meetings that really control and have the pools of capital, like the high net worth investors, the banks and the banksters, the technocrats like the Elon Musks, they were all at the table negotiating these deals. I covered that, last week. But what do we need now? Well, we are all told that the House passed Trump's big, beautiful bill. And this is essentially, I'll break it into a few parts. There's many different ways we can go down here, but you can see how this is optimized for the BlackRock portfolio companies to reshift wealth redistribution while this operation is being executed. Essentially, it was a gift to the proof of weapons network, and it is big and beautiful for the military-industrial complex. I'll take out a few highlights. So there is going to be $4.5 trillion of tax cuts, mostly for the top. For those companies that are able to take those and negotiate their tariff policies while Trump pretends he's coming after them, you then use these as negotiation tactics in order to redistribute strategic leverage around the BlackRock portfolio. And so this is money for the top, $4.5 trillion. Now, remember, this is when we're told they're cutting. They're meant to be going through austerity. So is it met with more and more budget? The answer is yes. This is your old school, printing money at the Federal Reserve level, if it can execute that, or then going into these deficits, creating inflation for the American people, not cutting back, and then those contracts through lobby groups go back to the corporations that sponsor all these bills as well. So $220 billion in new spending is broken down into $150 billion for defense, i.e. missiles, drones, war infrastructure for the military-industrial complex. And this is only the beginning. This is the beginning of the new Cold War in space, because now pretending that people are trying to invade America, it says it needs a new defense system over the top, and it's going to be connected to satellites, which just coincidentally is the technology that NASA gave Elon Musk while it's building all of its data through other technologies that were given to Elon Musk, while it builds a social credit score for stable coins that were given to Elon Musk, because it is simply a proxy for the military industrial complex, as Edward Snowden revealed to us through this structure of redistributing data for what eventually will be a social credit score, so that you need to manufacture violence, which I'll cover in the geopolitical section, so that you can usher in these changes and pretend that you have a constitution, when really you have these corporations that are engineering strategies, and you're just being distracted thinking you need to change it from Biden to Trump or whoever comes next. Anyway, more money for the military industrial complex to create more violence, for the proof of weapons network, and redistribute more wealth over to those corporations. $70 billion for border militarization. Nice contract if you can get it, especially if you have the ability to create wars that then leads to refugee crisis, then leads to people fleeing, then leads to contracts with hotels so that you get paid from the government as you have this illegal immigration, and you can have then the cheap labor through the different mechanisms, and then you can say we're fighting back against it when you need to change the narrative, and then you can engineer civil unrest internally by fueling racial tension. We'll cover more of that, what we're seeing right now, and religious tension in the geopolitical section. So you get to use more border monetization. And then a $1 trillion in cuts to Medicaid, and basically over the next 10 years. Basically, this is just crony capitalism, business as usual, dressed up in, if you put the word big beautiful bill on top of it, you can get people to believe that this is about make America great again and rebuilding the manufacturing base, while they take away all of those jobs by getting the budget to the artificial intelligence, the robotics, and the corporations that are going to profit from building in all of these robotics that's going to take the job. Then they can have the stable coins, and then they can issue that universal basic income eventually as it is neared. Now, what do you get to do in the meantime? You get to say you're the greatest and biggest economy in the world. You get to engineer some fake GDP when it was just government spending, and now you've got about 35% of that. Why? Because this is exactly what the central bank was created to do. Make the government bigger, fund wars, get the world into debt, roll over the Ponzi, and then engineer a change in world order as you usher in a neo-technocratic oligarchy, and essentially you can either go to communism and a blockchain through a CBDC, which I'll probably do in Europe and UK, or you can go to just handing over stable coins, engineering the system, and then allowing for an exit where people get their bitcoins through crony capitalism, as they're doing in the US. As I said, everything that was happening everywhere was the beta. But you get some fake GDP. So you can pretend that you've got a bigger economy than the one that actually has the manufacturing base and sovereign wealth, which is China, because this is the new transition to the multipolar world as well. You basically get some debt-fueled growth that is built upon bombs, bailouts, and corporate welfare, where you socialize the losses and privatize the gain. Now, who actually gains from this? Well, as I said, it's the BlackRock portfolio companies, whether it be Lockheed Martin, whether it be Raytheon, whether it be Boeing, whether it be Northrop Grumman, whether it be General Dynamics. But overall, BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, that all own shares in each other, that are essentially now CEO of this proof of weapons network that relies upon the debt-based Ponzi scheme of the Federal Reserve, which benefits the bank shareholders that own the Federal Reserve. But who pays? Basically, everyday Americans. They pay, they get priced out of healthcare, they get priced out of food, and they get priced out of peace, except for ones that resist and go for Bitcoin peaceful proof of work rather than fueling the debt-based proof of weapons network. Now, remember, if you can create inflation in the US of 3 to 5%, that translates to 300 to 500% in the countries that are burdened with the IMF debt-based Ponzi scheme as well. And so the US economy is essentially a debt-based Ponzi scheme created by the Federal Reserve for the benefit of BlackRock portfolio companies with the government subordinate to them. Growth with the debt, with the US dollar proof of weapons network equals war plus inflation. That is the formula. And then you can reset the order whenever you choose to through controlling those rates as well. I'm not going to cover this right now, but the next transition, I believe, is transitioning to a narrative around a new Cold War based upon space. And so Elon Musk is the person that gets to usher in that wave. And now you're starting to get narratives that you need a defense over America, an Iron Dome like they built in Israel, which was the beta test of the control technology in Gaza, where artificial intelligence was being used in order to have a surveillance illegal occupation. And when you want to change it to genocide, you can do that through Lavender and the technology that Palantir is using to sell to these various governments. You usher up religious tensions, you create fake ideological narratives that fear people into having to transfer all this money over to the military industrial complex, like Iran versus Israel. You then fund them at different militias. I'm going to go through this in the geopolitical section when we cover what the South Africa meeting was about. And then you need a dome over your country, which requires access to satellite. And now you can usher in a new arms race, Cold War, between Russia and China and US to print off more money, roll over the debt, back it by stable coins, and fear people into believing that they have to do that because Iran's coming over on UFOs in order to implement Sharia law in America, Europe, and UK, and therefore he's the next Hitler, and we need to protect ourselves and create a dome so that essentially you can take missiles where every bomb creates a shitload of profit and blow it up with other missiles, which makes more profit, with satellites, which makes more profit, and then you can fear people into exactly what we're getting here. So anyway, the narrative is all about pushing down confidence in the US debt right now. Confidence is falling. That's why rates are going up. And this is no surprise that at the same time, Bitcoin hit new all-time highs, as we covered in This Week in Bitcoin. Essentially, the proof of weapons network is buying Bitcoin to protect themselves while they usher in this new transition. And you should probably do the same too. While Trump is giving you the narrative of Make America Great Again to rebuild the manufacturing base, he is doing the bidding of the BlackRock portfolio companies and engineering the system so that he can profit from short the dollar, long Bitcoin, and become a stablecoin issuer. So rather than doing what he's saying, rather than falling for the MAGA narrative, how about you just make yourself great again? Because that's what the Trump administration is doing. They are making themselves great again at the expense of making America great again. So why don't you make yourself great again? You can boycott the Fed with Bitcoin. You can boycott BlackRock by holding it in self-custody. And you can boycott the military industrial complex simply by paying down your debt. And I know it's not as simple as that, and some people are not in that situation, but the more you fall for their scheme of borrowing against your Bitcoin so that they can margin call you and take your Bitcoin, and you can fuel the military industrial complex and the proof of weapons network, because it relies upon you creating more debt to keep the scheme alive. You can drain it by boycotting the banks, by not borrowing against your Bitcoin, and by not falling for these debt-based Ponzi schemes, and by not going into all the different ways that they want to create in order to make this so-called Make America Great Again. You cannot solve monetary reform with tax reform. And so until we see monetary reform, don't believe a damn word they say, and keep watching Bitcoin Hard Talk. I'll share what I know as we see it as well. So a little bit of narrative that came after that. What do we get? Trump said that he has informed Tim Cook of Apple that he expects iPhones sold in the United States will not be manufactured in India. Remember, it was all about manipulating the market up and down for the hedge funds. Remember, there was meetings in the White House where Charles Schwab was sat there, and Trump was saying, hey, it was great. You made a $1 billion. You made $1 billion. You made $1 billion. While I made that announcement on True Social. And then he said, in order to get the market back up, he was saying, we'll do a deal with India. We're going to make an amazing announcement. It's around the corner. It's coming. It's around the corner. You just change the narrative anytime you want to do another pump and dump, and that can restabilize wealth over to those that are on the right side of the inner circle that have Aladdin and the BlackRock technology that is getting access to the right information. So he's saying iPhones will not be created in India now. They won't be created anywhere else. They'll be made in America, which means your iPhone goes from $1,000 to $20,000. You get a redistribution. And what happens? Apple just negotiates because you've given it strategic tools from these tax cuts to do a deal that is net neutral, and it only impacts the medium-sized businesses that go bust because they can't sell these iPhones, if we're to believe that what he's saying is actually true, which of course is not. It's ushering robotics, because it is going to take all of your jobs, and that's the only way it can be done in America. And in the meantime, it will be done in China, and India will be able to try and build some of that speciality, but instead it will just be buying it off China and building an arbitrage, just as it did when Russia was sanctioned and it was selling oil and gas to Europe at higher prices. Well, that's what that one was all about. Okay. So we had an announcement that was today that he told Tim Cook that those iPhones won't be made anywhere else but America. And that led to the next wave of correction in the market on Friday ahead of a holiday period. And then what else did Trump come out to do? He threatened a 25% import tax on all iPhones unless they actually do this. And so the people that are trying to get their orders of iPhones will be like, do I order them now? Do I stop ordering them? Do I charge 25% extra? Do I take a hit? Do I go bust? Do I carry on? You extend this for as long as possible, and then you can consolidate more and more companies and extract wealth from Main Street over to Wall Street, which will be funding these leverage buyouts as well. And at the same time, Trump recommends a 50% tariff on all purchases imported from European Union starting 1st of June. What was the immediate reaction? Exactly as I said when I said what these tariffs were all about. It would have three impacts. It would create a global recession. It would have a COVID effect within America, where the people either get crowded out of purchasing, or the richer people, which is most consumption, can afford to pay the higher price. because they need to import from China still and put the import tariff and factor that into their price. And the ones that can't do it, that try and take the hit, they have an M&A spree consolidated into the large companies that will be able to use the tax bill and negotiate deals because they're global institutions. They'll also consolidate the distressed export countries, as much of those assets as possible. And you will drive all the relationships closer to BRICS, which is the new multipolar world order that I believe BlackRock is pushing in. And tariff is the perfect way of doing it. So you get Trump in, and then you execute this. And what happens? So the index, remember what I said in that blog post, DXY, you can go back to the blog post where I said the key indicators. This is a basket of currencies. There's differences between devaluing the dollar, which means the purchasing power of the dollar goes down. That always goes down by like 95% since the Federal Reserve has come into power. But then there is relative strength. And so when we say weakening the dollar, we mean the dollar traded against other currencies like the euro, the Swiss franc, and the pound. And so DXY is an index of the top 6 currencies like Canadian dollar, Mexican peso, and their rate against the US dollar. And I said the indicator is when it goes below the psychological barrier of $100, and they're trying to weaken it below that. And to strategically weaken the dollar, because remember, this is about removing the world reserve currency status and drawing everything over to the BRICS corridors as well. So you can split the world up into the multipolar world order. And so in the macro section, the DXY this week, immediately after all of that, went below $100 and got weaker after this announcement. And so that is everything that happened this week in macro. And so, as I said, geopolitics is fluid, macro is fluid. I'll keep changing as things go through. And now we've done this week in Bitcoin in part 1 of Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 82. We've now done this week in macro. We're going to do finally in part 3, the important part that brings this all together. So we can understand why, and this is the dangerous part, why are they manufacturing civil unrest right now? Why are we getting all of these narratives? And why was this the timing for South Africa to visit the White House to go through a Zelensky-style humiliation ritual? I'm going to be covering that because we're going to actually watch it together live. And I haven't watched the full interview, but I saw some of the highlights. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a bit of a background following the money on what is happening in the region, why I watched the South Africa humiliation ritual with Trump in the White House together, and then I'm going to give you the final analysis from following the money around what I think is happening in the region. So we still got a chunk more to get through. You can either watch this as a separate section in part 3, this week in geopolitics. You can download it on the podcast. Make sure that you've got you followed the podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Also, if you haven't subscribed to my channel, I will keep giving this free information. I'm trying to get above 100,000 subscribers, and it's just around the corner. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe, hit the bell symbol, hit all, and you'll get a notification. But also, if you prefer Rumble, if it gets shut down when they do the review over 100K, because they may not like what I'm saying, we're doing backups on Rumble. And you can also go to simondixon.com and get a free Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal with all the backups, all the other gifts, the Great Depression of the 2020s video series, where I was forecasting how to protect yourself, all of these different things. You can get that for free. And you get a newsletter where whatever happens, I'll make sure you've got the links to wherever we go live. Right, I'm going to refresh the